Hey, Sunburnt, what's up? And today I'm gonna do a review of the new Kamasi Washington album, Heaven and Earth. So, Kamasi Washington, if you don't know who he is a band leader, a composer, a saxophonist, a jazz musician who released the Epic not too long ago, which is a triple album. And it is an epic album. It lives up to its title really well. And it's just a really amazing jazz album that ended off as one of my favorite jazz albums of the 21st century. And then after that, we waited for a couple of years, and then he started to release these teaser singles towards this album, which is 2 hours and 24 minutes long, which is, to be honest, not as long as the Epic, which is 3 hours long, but there is actually a companion EP which adds 38 more minutes to this overall album. So, that's a lot of minutes. And, for this album, Heaven and Earth, it basically has 2 discs, disc 1, Heaven, and disc 2, Earth, and it has 8 tracks on each disc, which makes up to 16 tracks. So this album has 2 discs, disc 1 Heaven and disc 2 Earth, and it has 8 tracks on each disc, which makes up to 16 very long-winded tracks. Alright, people are going in and out. And this album is full of grand and dense spiritual jazz pieces that ranges between 8 minutes to 12 minutes usually, so that's really long. And this album is also packed with solos and improvs, from pianos to saxophones to trumpets to keyboards. It's very versatile when it comes to solos. And most of these tracks on the album also has this crazy backing choir that sings these religious harmonies that are pretty epic, and there is also a vocalist, a female vocalist, I believe, in this album, but mainly it's Kamasi. And most of this album feels very trippy and transcendental, and it also brings out a religious and very spacey vibe to it as well. And for most of the tracks on the album, it's very lengthy, and it tries to make this instrumental build-up, which builds up to an insane climax, and it really tries really hard to be epic. And sometimes maybe it's a little too much, maybe it's a little too lengthy, but for most of the time, I think the build-up pays off really well. And there are also a couple of tracks on this album where it's so dense, it's kind of hard to tangle, it's kind of hard to comprehend, it begins to lose form. But other than that, the tracks are still pretty crazy, wild, and beautiful, and gorgeous, and really well arranged and composed as well. The album starts off with Fists of Fury, which is basically a nod to the theme song of the Bruce Lee movie Fists of Fury, and this is an exciting and laser-focused introduction to a jazz album, and I just really, really love this track. It's one of the best singles of 2018 so far, in my opinion. And I just really love the melodies, and especially how the piano played them out on this track. It's sometimes very sympathizing and sweet, yet sometimes very fierce and determined. And we also get these very fiery and flamey improvs, which are crazy intense and very, very high-skilled as well. Although it's not super tight or super exciting or anything, it's still very melodic, very smooth, and very well composed. And then the second track is Can You Hear Him, which is another really great jazz banger in my opinion. You get these very groovy pianos and sax bass, and it builds up to a very magical and dreamy and lively roller coaster that's explosive. And I also really dig the electronic keyboard solo in the middle of this track. It's very tasteful, and it adds such a weird layer of texture on top of the original dreamy texture of this track. And I just really love the nimble bass and the interstellar solos on this track as well. The third track is Hup Tones, which is almost as equally groovy. And the pianos in the beginning are very cutesy and groovy and trippy, and it's going up the scale, slithering up the scale in a very slick way, in my opinion. It kind of reminds me of a ringtone for some reason. And it also has a Latin groove on this track. And, maybe this track could have been, more dynamic. Maybe there could have been more changes on this track. But still, I love this track for what it is. It's really trippy, really groovy, very memorable, and it sounds very interesting and colorful as a jazz track. And the fourth track, it's not that bad as well. It's titled Connections, which is a very nocturnal and moody track, really washed out and spacey and hollow as well. And it's just a very relaxing, spiritual jazz piece that you would grab a drink and listen to and just fall asleep because it's so relaxing. And the fourth track is also very relaxing. It's titled Tiffakonkae, and it is probably the most lighthearted track on this entire album. And the pianos are very comforting. Although you can argue that maybe it's a little redundant and repetitive. Maybe it's a little too sleepy. Maybe it's a little slog. But I think it's still very gorgeous and very relaxing. And once again, the texture and the color of this track is fantastic. And it's sonically satisfying, in my opinion. And then we have the Invincible Youth, which is probably the weakest track on the entire disc 1. I kind of like the avant-garde-esque, chaotic intro. It's very crazy and messy. And the rest of this track is pretty sweet, but still kind of forgettable. It has this very trippy, muddy, psychedelic bass in the back that keeps looping around and around. And there's also a guitar solo in the middle that feels pretty lackluster. This track, maybe it's a little too lengthy, maybe it's a little too cumbersome, maybe it tries too hard to be grand and monumental. It kind of loses its form. It gets a little messy at times, but still, it's not bad, it's not awful, and it's very magical and dreamy as well. And then we have Testify, which is a really sweet and straightforward breather amongst all these gigantic spiritual jazz pieces, because this is basically a very sweet and very heartwarming love song that also kind of reminds me of a musical, of a song in a musical. And I also really love the rich backing instrumentals on this track. It kind of brings this reverby vibe to it. And then disc 1 ends off with One of One, which is another absolute jazz banger on disc 1, and it concludes disc 1 really well with a bang. And it has these very lush and lavishing pianos, and the pianos plus the saxophones plus the drums, it builds up to a very dancey and groovy Latin jazz piece that's extremely memorable. Again, the piano chords, they are very dancey and very polished and very, I don't know how to describe it. It's the kind of music you would listen to at night with a bunch of other people around you, but it's not like a very exciting and warm event, a hot event, but it's more like very classy night piece. And disc 2 starts off with The Space Traveler's Lullaby, which is an extremely beautiful and spacey jazz piece that almost feels like an ambient piece, but way more, I guess, colorful and jazz oriented to be an ambient piece. And it almost feels like One of One is where we pause the album, and The Space Traveler's Lullaby is where we press the resume button, and it's like we're dropped off in the middle of the album in a random deep cut, and it feels really magical. And it feels very spacey as well. It feels like there are spaceships on the sky slowly gliding on top of our heads. It feels very magical. There are moments on this track where it feels like it's never ending, but it's still a very sound rich and very moving piece of opener for disc 2, which is pretty odd as well. And then we have the second track of disc 2, which is Lullaby Soul, which is another Latin jazz cut off the album. But this track really messed me up. This track really messed me up. And it's because of the very dead-sounding, robotic auto-tune in the beginning and in the end of this track. That really kind of ruined this track for me. Still, like, beside of the auto-tune, it's still a very meh, very underwhelming track. You know, nothing really stands out that much. So yeah, this track is probably the most underwhelming track on the entire album. However, the third track kind of picks up the pace with Street Fighter Maz, which is also one of the lead-up singles to this album. It has these very nice marchy drums in the beginning, and it's just a very funky and chill jazz track that I wish it could have been not longer, but maybe a little more grander and a little bit more bolder. I also really like the backing choir on this track. It's very quirky, and it kind of brings off this religious vibe, although in the front of this wall of music, it sounds way more playful and chill and slick and cutesy as well. And although the bass line may be a little squelchy, if that's a weird word, maybe a little repetitive, but it really adds momentum to this track and makes this track even more lively and even more groovy as well. And then we have Song for the Fallen, which is almost 13 minutes long, which is also the longest track on the entire album. To be frank, it is a pretty forgettable track. Not that it's bad or awful or terrible or anything, but it's pretty forgettable. I've listened to it for like 4 times, but yet right now I can hardly remember anything that stands out from this track. Yeah, it's kind of cumbersome. It's kind of sleepy in a dull way, and everything feels very washed out. Again, not that it's bad. I like the dreamy texture, and I like the colors that gives off of this track, but it's still a pretty dull and mundane sounding track, so, eh. And then we have Journey, which is also not that great, although it's, definitely better than Song for the Fallen and Lullaby Soul. It's another vocal jazz piece. Although it's not as good as Testify, it still sounds very interesting, and I like how Kamasi Washington tries more in terms of vocal jazz. But I just don't like the melody, the arrangement of the vocals on this track. It sounds very young and innocent, and it kind of feels kind of blunt because of that for some reason. And the rest of this track kind of builds around that groove, which is actually not that bad. But again, a little bit forgettable, maybe. And then the last 3 tracks of the album is actually pretty not bad. We have the Psalmnist, which has an extremely groovy guitar, and the beat is extremely odd, but very special and very satisfying to listen to. And it's a very weird, quirky, disorienting jazz track that goes back and forth, up and down, constantly, and it brings a very special vibe, in my opinion. And then we have the penultimate track, Show Us the Way, which is epic. We get these, we have these backing choir vocals, which sings in such an animated way up against these somewhat eccentric yet comforting pianos and banging drums that are not too loud, but yet it adds the momentum, it adds the rhythm, and the chords are kind of descending in a very dreamy and somewhat disorienting yet magical way. It's so magical and nostalgic. It feels like an amusement park in sunset. If you have been to an amusement park for almost the entire day, like in the sunset, it feels very depressing, yet so magical, yet so happy, yet so strange, yet so fear and paranoia inducing. It's all sorts of weird emotions together. You feel so alone, yet you feel like you're in the middle of something greater than you think. You feel like you're being pushed to a corner of the world that gets very mystic and somewhat mysterious and otherworldly. And this track really gives off that vibe. And yeah, it's very sad, but yet it's eye-opening, and it feels very reluctant as well. And the instrumentals builds into a very incredible climax. And in the middle of this track, you also get these rushes of strings bashing against a very intense and frenzy saxophone solo that is amazing. And then we get the last track, Will You Sing, which is almost as monumental as Show Us the Way, except it goes to another direction, another path. It has these sturdy pianos in the front that's again very reluctant, very nighttime, and the singing on this track is really amazing. It's very smooth, very grand and monumental and bold. It kind of reminds me of the Game of Thrones soundtrack a little bit, maybe, the track Misa in particular, and it also really, really reminds me of the Lord of the Rings soundtrack, except this track is even more quirky, it's even more weird, it gives off an even more religious vibe, and the saxophone solo in the middle of this track is also very fiery, and it concludes the entire album really well, in my opinion. Although the rhythm on this track may be a little static, maybe a little too unchanged, but melody-wise, it's still a very grand and epic ending to the album that is undoubtedly almost perfect for ending an album like this, as lengthy and as long-winded as this. And I also like how skippy and messy the beat kind of sounds. It kind of gives this texture that's really nice. So overall, this is a pretty solid album, not gonna lie. Although it's not everyone's cup of tea, maybe it's a little too cumbersome, maybe it's a little bit too sleepy, and it definitely, like, I agree with the statement also that this album lacks eccentric, heavy, exhilarating jazz pieces like the Magnificent Seven off of the Epic. And of course, it's also undeniable that Kamasi Washington is not like a legendary jazz musician or anything. His music is no way as quality as John Coltrane or Miles Davis's music, but still is a very beautiful and very lively album full of amazing, fiery frenzy, intense saxophone and piano and keyboard solos and improvs, and it's way more fine-tuned and well-mixed on this album as well, and I like how the themes of space and religion kind of play out throughout the album as well. And even if you hate this album, or even if you don't like this album that much, I mean, don't look at this album as if it's supposed to be a very pure jazz album. Look at this album as if it's an instrumental album, perhaps. Maybe you'll love it even more because it's very lively. The texture is really dreamy, very soft, and it's very colorful as well. Every track here gives off a different vibe, slightly at least. And yeah, there are tons of highlights on this album as well. So the worst is Vi Lua Vi Sol, and the best is Fists of Fury, the intro cut. I'm giving the new Kamasi Washington album Heaven and Earth an 8 out of 10. So, have you listened to the new Kamasi Washington album? From 1 to 10, how much did you rate it? Like if you like it, and subscribe if you want more.